Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Meet the Solutionaries on greentv.com. I'm very pleased to introduce you to someone who I just met in person or in person on Zoom, but who I've been aware of. Someone told me about Juli when they heard what I do, environmental media. They said, you have to meet Juli. She's written a book about jellyfish. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Well, she has, and that was her first book, and has just recently written a book about coral. And we're going to be talking about both those books. Juli Berwald, it's such an honor to have you here. And in addition to an author and a mother, you have a science background. So, but first, you have great titles for your books and your writing is exquisite. So I want to make sure I mention that. The first one was Spineless, The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And the most recent one is Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. And thank you for your devotion to raising awareness about, well, I guess jellyfish would be kind of unsung heroes. Coral, there's coral sexier. We're going to talk about that, but just go back a little bit and tell us how you went from working in science to become an author, a writer, wanting to tell the world about what you were learning.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Betsy. It's delightful to have the opportunity to talk with you on Green TV. Actually, kind of to back up, in college, well, even to back up farther, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So sort of as far from the ocean as you could get on in our country. And I think we went on like a few trips to the beach when I was a kid, but I had never stuck my head in the water. I'd never gone snorkeling until I went on a study abroad program my junior year of college. And I was pretty miserable. It was in Israel, and I was pretty miserable. I just didn't fit very well with the other people on my program. And there was like sort of a sign on the wall, and it was like marine ecology course over winter break, sign up here. And I did. And they pretty much put us on a bus, drove us through the desert to the Red Sea, pulled us off the bus, threw snorkels at us and said, get in the water. And in this sort of abrupt way that Israelis can be. And so I kind of awkwardly put on this mask and snorkel and put my fins on, and I stuck my head in the water, and I was like, what is this? Because the Red Sea, I mean, it's one of the richest places on our planet. So, my first shot at looking underwater happened to be this amazingly brilliant, beautiful place, but it just was so full of life and energy and color and texture. And I couldn't believe that this existed on the same planet as us.
Was that a lot, right?
That was in a lot. Yeah. And then for the rest of the week, just everything about what was happening in the ocean was like a revelation to me. And I was like, I'm going to be a marine biologist, but life doesn't go that way exactly. I ended up getting into grad school to study satellite imagery of the ocean, which was a really interesting thing to do because at the time, we didn't know how much carbon dioxide. We knew we were pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through fossil fuels, but we didn't know how much the ocean was absorbing through photosynthesis, which is, the way that plants take up carbon dioxide and make it into sugars and lipids. But I worked on that for my PhD, and the answer is that the oceans have taken up about a quarter to a third of the carbon dioxide we've emitted from fossil fuels. So it's really buffered us. But even more importantly, it's taken up above 90% of the heat that our atmosphere has been holding from, as it's warmed from that carbon dioxide. So the ocean has really acted as this incredible sink to the things we've done to our planet. But so I was a scientist and I was looking at all these questions, and then I fell in love, and life changes when you fall in love. I met my husband. We moved to Austin, Texas, and I had a postdoc, but I fell off the academic path, sort of not being in a group of people who were working on satellite imagery of the ocean. I was just on my own, and I got a job as a textbook writer. And I learned that I loved writing because, as opposed to sort of the more technical work I'd done as a scientist, lots of people could understand what I was doing. And I found the communication part just like really important and valuable. And I started writing magazine articles, and then really much of the story is in the story of Spineless, the jellyfish book. It's really about like my struggle to move from being a scientist to being a science communicator, which there's trade-offs and there's benefits to both. And I definitely struggled with making that shift. But ultimately I decided that sharing my voice with the public was a thing that it's more authentic to me.
And you
And
have company in that, in these climate scientists like Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe and Hansen and James Hansen, who, they didn't think it was their role to speak up, but they've had to speak up
yeah,
and becoming more comfortable being activists and advocates.
yeah. And it's an interesting thing because when I was in graduate school, and I think it's changing now, but there was an idea that scientists really were not allowed to be advocates, that scientists were really there to do the work, to find the information, and then to hand that information off to people who were
Church and state separation,
that's
like
right,
allowed.
experts in policy. And now we've discovered that the information we handed off hasn't been used
Right.
effectively. So scientists are really having to step into this role of sharing information in a way that they never expected to when they were being trained.
And sometimes some are better than others at communicating. Jim Hansen, who was the one who first sounded the alarm about climate change back in 1988, in Congress, but he's just kind of quiet, soft-spoken, eloquent as heck, but,
Right.
like get mad,
Yeah.
Even Al Gore, I think, did not get angry enough, and, different styles, but anyway, go
Different
back to.
styles, and that's one thing is like, I think we need all these voices, right? Like the voices of, yeah, I mean, someone once said to me when I was writing my book about jellyfish, someone else wrote a book about jellyfish, and I was like, oh, maybe I should stop. But that person said, no, there's an audience for everyone. And I think that that's a really important, not everyone hears messages in the same way. And so Jim's message may hit someone the right way, and someone,
Sure.
who's louder and more aggressive that may get another person to respond. So the more voices, I think, the better, really.
Absolutely, the more the better.
Yeah.
So let's talk about jellyfish. I mean, they're like
Sure.
the kind of thing to avoid if you go to the beach and you don't want to get stung, and they're kind of yucky and they're kind of hard to see because they're clear-ish. How did you focus on this lowly? That's not the right word, and I don't mean to.
No,
I'm sure they're very cute critters once you get to know them.
yeah, I mean, jellyfish are an amazing muse for a writer because they waft between angel and devil, right? Like, yes, like you said, like you don't want to get stung by them. In fact, they can kill you. Some of the species, very few, but there are a few species that can. And, but yet when you look at them, they're ephemeral, they're elegant, they do all these things in the water, and you're just like, what is up with this creature? They're amazing. So yeah, so they have this sort of, you can't quite pin them down, and that's like really fun to write about.
They don't really
Also,
have a face, right? Is there?
well, no, they have many faces. In fact, that's like one of the cool things about them. They, if you imagine them, the top part is their bell. And if you look at jellyfish, like at the aquarium or something, in between each of their scallops around the edge, those are called lappets. There's kind of like an intensified area. You'll see it's like a little bit whiter or whatever color. And that's actually their face. It's called a rhopalium. And on it, they have eye spots, or some of them actually have camera eyes. And they have a nose, kind of like a nose, like they can smell chemicals in the water. They can sense currents. It's this thing called a touch plate. They have actually like these things called statuses, which are like our inner ear. They give the jellyfish a sense of what's up and what's down. And there's actually something called a pacemaker in there as well, which works like the pacemaker in our heart, and it controls how fast they pump. So they are actually looking out at the world in all directions at all times. They're not cephalized like we are. They're like a distributed information system, more like the internet or something, that has all kinds of sensors, like looking in all directions at all times. And it's really a complicated system. Of course it has to be, because jellyfish have existed for more than 500 million years. So, whatever's keeping them alive really is like a stable, sturdy system that can handle all the things the oceans has thrown at it for all these, millennia. So yeah, so they have many faces and they have a complex neurological system too.
Interesting. So they have a face that only a mother jellyfish could love, even though it's hard for us to see them. They're
Yeah.
cute in their own way, very intricate and intelligent, right? Like you said, they have their own intelligence. They've been around forever. They're also proliferating with climate change. So what does that indicate?
So, and actually, I want to just say like that is like not a tight connection. This is one of the problems with jellyfish is that we don't know what the baseline is. For the whole 20th century, jellyfish were largely ignored by science. They were the kind of the ugly little gooey stepsister of the cool things like tuna and sharks and even coral. And so, yeah, so the way that scientists explored the ocean for the 20th century was, you go out on a boat, you drag nets through the water, you lift those nets up, and then you dump them on the back of your boat, and then you sort through what you find. And jellyfish were problematic because they could sting you. So there's actually stories of scientists pouring bleach over whatever they hauled up to get rid of the jellyfish first, to get rid of the stingers, and so that they could sort through it without getting hurt. And so and also, if you're going through the water with a net, you're destroying jellyfish as you bring them up on the boat. So we don't know what jellyfish were doing in the 20th century. And so there's a huge debate among jellyfish scientists, like, are their numbers really increasing or not?
But there's no census?
There's no baseline, right?
So
there's no baseline. Like we can't, we've started looking at jellyfish more seriously in the 21st century, but so we have 20 years of data, but what we don't know what they used to be. So it's a very difficult thing to say, yes, they're proliferating because of climate change. So I just want to not get ahead of the science on that. Now, there's other ways people have looked at things, and you can look at things locally along coastlines. And so if you take all the data we have, some of it is crappy data, and include anecdotal data, which are like newspaper reports of years when there's big jellyfish blooms. And then you look at the data broken up among these what are called large marine ecosystems, which are like different parts of the world that are connected together ecologically. Then the most recent census shows that in about 60% of the world's coastlines, jellyfish numbers do look like they're going up. But I want to be really careful to not just say something that hasn't been published and isn't in the scientific paper, because I'm very science-based in everything I write.
And you want to teach us who don't know anything about this accurately. Are they sturdier? Is that why they might be able to withstand warming water? Is that one of the hypotheses?
So theoretically, yeah, there's some really cool reasons why jellyfish are doing better in today's world, and they're not all climate change. So the one reason why we think that they could be doing better in today's world is because there are some jellyfish that proliferate faster in warmer water. So, but we have to remember there's thousands of species of jellyfish. So there are certain ones that we think, some of these moon jellyfish do seem to reproduce faster in warmer water. And moon jellyfish are the ones that have sort of that 4-leaf clover on the top of them. They're the most common ones you'll see in an aquarium. But it turns out that once they started looking at those with DNA, there might be 17 species of moon jellyfish that all look the same. And we all thought they were the same species before we started looking at them with DNA. So it's complicated. Jellyfish are complicated.
So are coral, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But I read a little bit of your book about coral, and want to finish the whole thing. It's fascinating about the way that they mate, reproduce, if you will. How do jellyfish do it?
Okay, so this is
over to coral.
And this is actually really the crux of what's going on with jellyfish. Is they have this crazy reproductive system, and so the jellyfish that the Medusa that we know and love, that's really just part of a jellyfish's life. So they make eggs and sperm, which fertilize and form little larvae, which are called planula larvae, that look like a little furry tic tac. And then they sort of swim down and find a hard surface to attach to, and they grow into a polyp, which is like a sea anemone. It looks like a sea anemone. And they like to live in the shadows underneath something, and they need they attach onto hard surfaces. So one of the reasons why we think that jellyfish may be doing better in today's world is because of so much coastal development, which has created all this habitat for jellyfish polyps. But here's the cool part, the crazy part about the jellyfish polyp is that, so it's kind of like this little sea anemone that's living there upside down in the shadows. It can split itself horizontally, like make little, yeah, it can split itself into many, 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 many polyps until it covers the entire bottom surface of like a dock or a jetty or something, kind of like grass. So it'll fill the whole dock or jetty. And then what happens is, I'm going to use my cup as sort of a demo here. So imagine this is a polyp, and here's it. It would have tentacles sticking out here. It will slice itself horizontally into like a stack of pancakes. And so one polyp can get sliced into, say, a dozen or 20 of these slices. And then each one pops off the top and becomes a little baby jellyfish. And they're called ephyra, and they look like swimming snowflakes. And then they mature into the medusa we see. So if we back up, a single larvae can become a polyp, which can then become a field of polyps, which then slice themselves into 20 or so pancakes, which each pop off and become jellyfish. So that's why we often see jellyfish in these huge swarms, because they do this kind of en masse. And so this is one of the reasons why we think jellyfish are doing well in today's world, is because there's all these surfaces that didn't used to exist, and it's all jellyfish polyp habitat.
See, there won't be a quiz. There will not be a quiz on this, but I just have to stop and say two things. One, I love how you can just raise your eco IQ by listening to one interview. I've just learned a ton about jellyfish, more than I ever thought I was interested in knowing. But two, it's fascinating. It just, you have to take a breath and just say, nature is so freaking amazing.
So freaking amazing. It blows your mind. I mean, it just, right.
And we're destroying it. Not to put a buzzkill on it, but how dare we? We humans. It's so intricate and amazing and miraculous. So, okay, I think that's probably enough about jellyfish for now. I'm sure there's a whole book. In fact, there's a whole book on it. I hope to read. But then you took something up that's a little more relatable. I mean, coral jewelry, and coral's got the beautiful color when it's live and thriving. And most people know that they're just amazing creatures. They're animals. Most people don't know that. And they're also condominium builders, because they house all these species, and they're also, I think, responsible for a quarter of all sea life. And that kind of reminds me of the bees that are responsible for pollinating a quarter of our agriculture, supposedly. So these are very, in addition to beautiful creatures, very prolific, very productive, very important. And seeing, my husband's a scuba diver, I'm not, but he gets so depressed when he goes down there, and it's just, I'm sure, I know you write about it, the brown slime, the dead coral reefs. Anyone who's seen Chasing Coral, of course, has seen the difference between a live and a dead coral reef. So, okay, tell us about that segue from jellyfish to coral. Was it like an immediate turn, or did you have a couple of others exotic species on your mind before you picked the coral?
Well, honestly, two things about that. So first of all, coral were what I first fell in love with. What in that story you asked me to tell at the beginning about, like, what brought me to marine science in the first place. And they were like my true love, and so I think I always hoped I would be able to write the story of coral. And I wonder if I chose jellyfish first because it was like dating the younger brother of coral, like coral and jellyfish are first cousins. They both are in the same phylum, which is called Cnidaria. They are united with the sea anemones in that same group. And they're all united because they have this amazing thing called the stinging cell, which we know mostly from jellyfish, but it turns out coral have the very same thing. But so I think once the jellyfish book was successful, I sort of I kind of played with the idea of like, should I write a coral book? But I knew that coral are in a really bad straits right now. And the reason is climate change. And so I was struggling with whether I could write a book about the demise of this animal which is so critical and underpins so much of ocean health. And, could I suffer through writing a whole book about that was basically an obituary to these incredible animals? And I knew I would struggle with that. I knew I couldn't write that story. And so, but I flirted with it. So I put in like a Google alerts on my email for coral reefs. And this meeting came up, which was in Florida, and it was called Reef Futures. It was in 2018. And there was this really interesting piece of it, which was that the Australians were going to be there. And I knew, the Australians have the biggest coral reef in the world, the Great Barrier Reef. And they were talking about some pretty extreme measures that they were going to go to protect the reef. And I was like, wow, are we at that point? And also, what are they doing? So I signed myself up to go to that meeting. And at that meeting, I discovered that, first of all, as you said, like the reefs are critically important. They take up less than 1% of our ocean's area, but 1/4 of all marine species depend on them. They're super, super important. But even at only, a fraction of a percent of the ocean's area, the ocean is so big that there are still so many corals. And even though mass bleachings have been, and we can talk a little bit about what that means exactly, a bleaching is in a minute, even though mass bleachings have been accelerating since 2010, I mean, they really didn't exist before 1983. And then there was one in the 90s, and then 2010. And then since 2016, we've been in a constant state of mass bleachings. Even though they've been accelerating, there's still all these survivors. There's still all these reefs that have coral that are doing well, and we can learn from that. And so there were all these scientists and coral, marine protection area practitioners who were there who were like, here's what we're doing, and we're not giving up yet. And that energy was like energy I felt like I could take with me into a book, into a whole book. And so that's what I did.
And what did you find? We hear so much bad news about coral dying, and it's climate change, it's warmer waters, but it's also, like you said, construction along the coast. And they're under so much negative influence from us, from human development, human beings, that it seems like, gosh, you can't change the temperature of the ocean water. So even if you can help them in one area.
But can't you?
Oh, give us some good news quickly. That's like a scoop here. Okay. How can we cool the oceans?
Yeah. So yes. So as opposed to the jellyfish story, which is the direct line between climate change and jellyfish is harder to make. With coral, it's a climate change story. I mean, the other things that affect coral health are water quality, and that has really become apparent in the Caribbean, where as things agricultural. So let me just say a little bit about coral biology, which is really, I think, so cool and so much fun to learn. So corals live, as we know, in the tropical band around our planet, right? And they live there. Why do they live there? They live there because they need the sunlight. That's where the most sunlight is. Now, why would an animal need sunlight? Because we know plants need sunlight, but why do animals need sunlight?
Underwater, especially.
Yeah. The reason is because coral okay, these waters, these tropical waters around our planet are really nutrient poor. They don't have fertilizer there. So I can go into that, but maybe it's like kind of the oceanography of the place. Like, it just turns out that, okay, I'll just say it quick because the ocean is sort of it's interesting. The ocean is a 2-layer system. So in the surface, you have all of the phytoplankton, the plants. And because that's where the sunlight is, because this, like you said, the sunlight dies away as you go deeper. And so so that's where like the busy part of the planet is, because you have the plants, and then you have the plankton that eat them, and then you have the fish that eat the plankton, and the fish that eat the little fish. Anyway, so that's where the busy ecosystems are. And then when things die, they fall down to the bottom of the ocean. And that's where you get the bacteria that, just like in our gardens, turn the organics into fertilizer. But how do you get the fertilizer back up to the surface where the phytoplankton need it to grow? It happens in what are called upwellings. And those happen because of the way the oceanography of our planet works, those happen in temperate parts of our planet. They don't really happen in the tropics. So the tropics are the deserts of the ocean. But yet we see all this life there. And the reason is because of the coral, because the coral teamed up with the plankton, with a phytoplankton. They said, come live inside of me, come live in my tissue like a tattoo, and I will feed you nitrogen from my waste, because we all make nitrogen waste. We animals all make nitrogen waste. That's what is in our urine. So they feed these algae that otherwise they feed these algae that otherwise wouldn't have food in the water, in those tropical waters. They feed them everything they need to eat.
Amazing.
And that partner, and then the algae in exchange that are living inside the coral, they give 90% of the sugars and lipids that they make from photosynthesis directly to the coral. So it's this very tight exchange system. And it's so powerful that the coral have all this extra fuel. And what do they do with it? They make limestone. They make their skeletons. They make the great reefs of the world. So they're powered by the sun through the algae that live in their tissue. They have so much extra energy that they can create the coral reefs that everything lives on, and is the richest, most diverse ecosystem, in the sea. So this is an incredible situation, and that's what makes the reefs of our planet. And the coral like to live in places that are nutrient poor, because it allows them to control how much the nitrogen that the algae get. And so when we add nitrogen fertilizer to our land, and then that runs off into the water through rainstorms, it changes the dynamic for the coral. It makes it harder for them. Yeah, it makes them harder for them. They've evolved for millions of years to live in these nutrient poor waters. And so we see coral diseases crop up in places where the water quality falls. And that's what we see a lot happening in the Caribbean. And that started in the 60s. And so that's why the Caribbean coral reefs have really suffered more than the Pacific coral reefs have.
So it's this cascading effect where there's negative influences. So definitely water quality is an issue. Overfishing, illegal fishing is an issue. But really the big issue with coral is climate change. And that is because this incredible symbiosis that I talk about, I call it the badass partnership in my book. We don't know why, but it lives very close to its thermal tolerance. When the water warms up by about 2 degrees for a period of a week or 2 weeks, the algae coral symbiosis breaks apart, and the algae leave the coral, and we don't know why. And we don't know even who throws the switch, who says, I want to break up, I want a divorce, or whatever you want to call it. We don't know if it's, I'm out of here. We don't know if it's the coral saying like, I'm feeling stressed. The water's heating up. I can't handle anything else. Like, like ramp up immune system. Like, let's clean everything we can. And they just kick these algae that they had been allowing to live in their tissues out. Or if it's the algae who's like, I'm not quite getting fed enough nitrogen anymore. I'm not feeling like this host is like treating me well. I'm going to reveal myself to the coral's immune system and make it kick me out. So we don't know which of those two things is happening, but it happens. And then when the algae leave, they take their color, they take their green pigment with them, and they take the fuel. They take that 90% of that sugar that they usually feed the coral with them. And so the coral suddenly is on starvation rations. And if it doesn't reestablish a partnership, if the water isn't cool and doesn't reestablish a partnership, the coral will die. And so that's what a coral bleaching is. And that's why climate change is really like the existential threat for coral reefs. And we should care about coral reefs in addition to them being so complex and beautiful. And we haven't even talked about how they reproduce You must tell us that because, I mean, if you haven't like just been bowled over by nature yet, you will be. I mean, just in this interview alone, I was. So for that, and then I also want to talk about some of the technologies that look promising for fixing coral reefs, if that's even possible.
Yeah, so the coral reefs are very romantic, and they can't, the coral animals, they, they're stuck, they're glued down by their skeleton, so they can't move to go find like, a mate to mate with. So what they do is to increase their chances of their eggs and their sperm meeting in the big wide open ocean. They use clocks, and the clocks that they use are the light of the moon and the temperature of the water and the light of the sun. And so every species has its own romantic timer that they use. And even different reefs have their own timers, but usually it'll happen in August after the full moon, about between 4 to 9 days after the full moon. And then each species, like a certain number of hours after sunset, the corals will release their eggs and sperm in unison, and down to the minute they will release their eggs and their sperm, and they will float upwards, hopefully, and they will meet near the surface of the water and fertilize each other and make the same kind of little tic-tac larvae that the jellyfish do, because they're very, like I said, first cousins. And those little larvae swim back down to the reef and find a promising spot to plant themselves for the rest of their life, and that's where the coral will grow.
And
So
we're mucking up that process too. Obviously, if they can't reproduce, this is not good news.
yeah. And there are some places in the Caribbean where the corals live too far away from each other for their eggs and their sperm to meet with each other. So one of the technologies that's happening is there are scientists and practitioners, reef practitioners, who are collecting eggs and sperm. They go down, they dive, and I got to do this in the book. And you go down at night and you just kind of sit there like watching these coral colonies, and then all of a sudden these eggs just like whoosh, they just emerge, and it's like you're in a reverse blizzard or something. I mean, I guess it feels like a little indecent, but it's just also magical. And so
Voyeur, you're a voyeur.
you're surrounded by like, reproductive material. So, but like they float up, and it's like, whoa. And then, so scientists will collect these eggs and sperm, put them together in the lab, mix them up, turn them into larvae form. They're developing these settling structures for the little larvae to swim down onto, and then they incubate them in these giant floating pools out in the ocean so that they can, some coral, the parents transfer the algae with them, and some of them they have to get from the environment. So they put them in these big pools and they incubate them long enough, like coral kindergarten, long enough for them to kind of like make it on their own. And then they will replant thousands of baby coral to the sea at a time. So that's one of the amazing things that's happening out there in the world.
And what else? Give us one or two more, because I hear about these various things that are being tried like over the last 10 years at, climate change conferences, but I haven't followed up to see which ones are working.
Yeah, so the most impressive one I saw was really undertaken by the Mars Candy Bar Company, which is a little surprising, but it turns out they have candy factories, chocolate factories on tropical islands where there's coral reefs, and where the people who work in their factories depend on the reef for additional income and for protein. It's estimated that between 500 million and 1 billion people rely on coral reefs for their primary source of protein, which makes a ton of sense because they are such productive parts of our sea. So as the coral reef starts to decline, people who have traditionally relied on the reefs for this extra food, they are unable to. And so Frank Mars, who is the grandson of the original Mars, he noticed this and he was like, what can we do? And he started working with some people in the factory who are really good at factory stuff. So they're very good at like tinkering and manufacturing and putting things together. And they came up with this idea, which the idea was for it to be portable, to be able to be made on any tropical island. So anywhere there's boat builders. And it's a rebar sort of structure that has 6 arms on it, and it's bent around, and they call them reef stars, and they sort of just stabilize a reef that has become rubble. And you can tie coral fragments onto it. Reef stars get networked together into huge galaxies, and they can lay down thousands of coral in a day. They can on these reef stars, because each reef star holds 15 coral. It's easy to do 100, 200, 500 at a time. And when you dive on these reefs 18 months later, you can hardly see the reef stars any longer. And I mean, just like the center of where these pieces of rebar come together, you'll see like a little star shape, but the coral overgrows it really well. And they really know what they're doing. They bump it up against a healthy reef. They even play the sounds of a healthy reef on their restorations. And that lures in these herbivores that help eat away at like macroalgae that may come in and outcompete the coral. And within 3 years, these restorations are magnificent. You can't tell that they were restored. So they're working in the part of the world that makes sense to work in, because the place they're working is the Coral Triangle, which is the center of coral biodiversity. They have a lot of help from the environment in this part of the world, but they're doing magnificent work. And so that's another example. And then the last one is maybe I'll go back to the can you change the temperature of the water question. And that was actually that's actually being tested in Australia. And it really was the reason why I went to that Reef Futures meeting in Florida in the first place. This idea is called cloud brightening. And the clouds over the sea are not as bright as clouds over land. And that's because there are fewer nucleators. So a nucleator is just something for a water droplet to form around. Clouds are made out of water droplets, but they need like a little piece of dust or a piece of pollen or something to form around. Over the ocean, we don't have much dust or pollen. So marine clouds are a little dimmer. And there were some calculations done in the 70s that said, like, if we could brighten marine clouds, we could actually stop climate change. And if we brighten them by 1%, just 1%. And so what would be the way to do this? Well, sea salt can act as a nucleator for marine clouds. And so what the Australians are doing is they are testing these things called cloud brighteners, where they actually aerosolize seawater, and these small micron, very bacteria-sized droplets of seawater float up to the clouds. They form nucleators, and the clouds brighten by just a little bit, by about 1%. And they found that there's local impacts underneath those brighter clouds where the temperature cools by about between 1 or 2 degrees. And that's just what we need to stave off coral bleaching. So they're testing this idea, and they did a demonstration project in 2020 that I was supposed to be on, but of course COVID, put an end to that. But the project, they did do the cruise, they tested the technology, it worked better than they expected, and so the Australian government has funded this idea 7-fold over what it had been, to continue testing and modeling and seeing if this may be a way to at least buy the corals some more time while we deal with climate change over a regional area. So this would be more than just restoring, corals here and there, or restoring even a hectare or 2 of corals. Like, this would be something that could be deployed over an entire region.
And when coral is restored, does it get its coral color back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is what, might need to be going on a little too long, but, and the other positive thing that I discovered in my book is that the coral themselves have some tricks up their sleeves. And one of those is really interesting, which is that when the coral bleach, they can reestablish a symbiosis with an algae. For the last 25 million years, they've worked with this one algae called Cladocopium. The name is irrelevant. It's just saying it so that you can hear a difference when I say a different name. So Cladocopium, like I said, feeds the coral 90% of the sugar they make from photosynthesis. What scientists are starting to see is that sometimes coral will reestablish a symbiosis with a new algae, this one called Duristinium. Duristinium only feeds the coral 65% of the sugar it makes from photosynthesis. So it's more selfish. It's a more selfish partner. But if you think about it, like what used to be like high-end real estate, with everything working and air conditioners in place and a defense system in place, is now kind of not, the air conditioner is broken. So the only tenant they can get is paying them less for this space. And maybe that's what the coral are going to have to do, is like have a tenant that pays them less for a while until we deal with climate change and they can reestablish the preferred tenant. But maybe having Duristinium around will allow them to get through these tough times that are in front of them. So we don't know what's happening. But the coral themselves also have some tricks up their tentacles.
I'm glad to hear they're so smart, much smarter than we are. Let's hope we're not dumb enough to kill them off and the rest of the beautiful, precious planet we have been given. So I could talk to you or listen to you all day. I highly recommend your books. You're just so animated about, this knowledge, and thank you. I would like to end the interview asking you to ask or tell our viewers what you would like them to do. We are Meet the Solutionaries, and you are talking about solutions, but I want to give people some sense of agency and empower them to take action, even if it's just, start paying attention to coral and share things and petitions, but perhaps more. What would you like to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. One of the things that's really hard about telling stories of the sea is that the sea is invisible to us so much of the time. And it's really the lifeblood of our planet. I mean, we depend on the ocean's health for our own health. And so, yes, please try to remember that the sea is here, that it supports us, and that we need to support it. So that's, the first thing. The next thing is, honestly, reach out to the people who represent you in Congress and tell them how important climate change is to you. It matters more than anything, because I can't begin to imagine a world where the coral reefs fail. And that is the prediction. Mm-hmm. So climate change is urgent. And if we can get our arms around it, it will matter not just for us up here, but for the whole, for the sea. So
individuals and families and communities can do everything, or should do everything they can, to reduce their emissions, their carbon footprint.
Yeah, but I mean, really, we need systemic change. So I don't want to put it on the individual. I think that we've had enough of that. Above.
Individual, systemic, everybody.
Yeah. I think we've heard for so many years that it's our fault, and as individuals, we need to change our behavior. We need systemic change. We need to tell our elected officials it's time for systemic change.
Mm-hmm. And we need to vote for leaders who understand
science, right,
and the need to listen to scientists. And you have been wonderful, a joy to listen to, even if the overall news is not positive. You've given me hope with your knowledge and your smile and the way you describe things. And your writing is even more gorgeous than your speaking, if that's possible. So I really want to urge our viewers to check out your books. Why don't you just give us the titles once again?
Yeah, so my most recent book is called Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. And then the jellyfish book is called Spineless, The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And you can find out more about me at juliberwald.com. And it's JuliBerwald.
And your next book is going to be fiction. And
let's hope so.
Well, I want to let you get back to your writing, because you are, like I said, a beautiful writer. And thank you for your contribution to our understanding of coral reefs and jellyfish. Who knew? Now we know. Now we know.
Now you know.
I feel much smarter about this, and hopefully our viewers do too. And mostly will care enough to read your books and to tell their friends, tell their enemies, anybody. That
Sure.
we need to save the ocean. And, I remember I've been doing this long enough that when we heard, oh, the ocean is sucking up all this carbon, it's a great carbon sink. But then but guess what? There's a problem with that, of course. Now there's no way.
It can only help us so much.
Right, exactly. We need to help nature help us. And there's no time to waste. So with that, I'll let you go. Thanks so much, Juli Berwald. It's been a real joy and great to have you as part of our Solutionary series.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Let's meet up when we're both in Austin again.
Let's do.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.